this seminar, I'll kind of talk about what the basic elements of a reply are, and then talk through some of the strategies that you can use to make them better, and also go through a worked example, kind of explaining a reply as we go through. Alright, so I guess the first and most important question is exactly what is a reply speech? So it is different to the other speeches given in the debate. So it's a 4-minute speech, and it's given right at the end of the debate, so after nerd negative. In terms of its impact in the debate, it is obviously half as long as an 8-minute speech, and therefore worth half as much when it's being scored. So a normal speech is between 70 and 80, a reply speech is between 35 and 40. But that said, you obviously can win a debate on a reply. So even if after the first half of the debate you're down, a really, really good reply can win it for you and kind of make the difference, which is kind of obvious given that, it's still scored, and if you have the greater number of points at the end of the reply, you should win the debate. The other important part is that it goes in reverse order, so you give the negative reply first and then the affirmative reply, and that's kind of done because it's a way of balancing the debate. So when people often say things like, oh, you can't bring that out at nerd negative, it's too late, which makes it not only difficult for, the nerd negative to do anything, but makes it difficult for adjudicators to decide how much to credit stuff brought out at nerd negative. A reply is a way of balancing that, because it gives the affirmative a chance to show how, in their case already, they have responded to the new pushes that the nerd negative speaker have brought out. Otherwise, in terms of technical stuff, it's given by the first or second speaker, so you can't have your nerd speaker give, on the negative, an 8-minute speech and then a 4-minute reply, so it has to be given by first or second. It's usually the first speaker, so you have more time to give it, but if whoever's second seems better at replies, then that's also totally fine. Then, essentially what it is used for is to explain why your team has won the debate that has already happened in the first, 6 speeches of the debate. And the most common explanation for what that exactly means is that it's described as a biased adjudication. So in the same way, the adjudicator will come up and suggest, well, here are my reasons why I gave it to one team over the other team. Your reply is pretending you are the adjudicator, and you've already determined that your team is the team that wins, and you're explaining why the material already given by your team in the debate is sufficient to prove that they should win the debate overall. So those are kind of the basics of what a reply exactly is and when it comes out. In terms of structure, 2 issues is kind of normally the standard reply format, because you only have 4 minutes. So if you try and do as much in a reply as you do in a normal speech, you won't fit it all in. Obviously, you can deviate from 2 issues, but I would usually suggest having a very good reason to do so. Good reasons might be things like you have one very short issue that takes not much time to explain and that the opposition never engaged with, so you can start your reply out with 30 seconds saying, we gave you this separate point about what China will do, and that has already won us the debate, now I'll engage in the rest of the debate in the other 2 issues. Similarly, those issues should have a similar amount of time spent on them, so it's not very strategic usually to have one issue that's 3.5 minutes and another that's 25 seconds, but again, you can have one longer issues, but I would again suggest having a reason to. So 2 issues that are about the same length is kind of the normal structure, but you can change if you think the debate would require it, or it would be more strategic for your team if you were to have 2 separate issues. Then on intros for a reply, I would say my personal advice for this, although some people again will disagree, is to have a short introduction at the affirmative reply. So because you've had 12 minutes at that point of just negative content, which is usually called the negative block, it's kind of good to re-establish what the affirmative has proven in that debate and what exactly their way of winning it is. So some kind of short issue that, might reiterate what the problem is in the debate, what the best argument of the affirmative is, what the largest deficiency of the negative is, and kind of just have 10 or 15 seconds to reorient the affirmative team in the debate. And then again, it's less necessary at negative reply, because we've just had 8 minutes of negative content, so if your intro is doing something like repeating an idea we just heard at Nerd Neg, it's usually not that important. But if you've got some really good kind of comment on overall strategy, and you think it would make a good introduction, totally go for it. So these are all general rules, but none of them are hard rules. So into some kind of basic do's and don'ts of replies, I would say the don'ts here are more important, and the do's are a little bit common sense. So, do explicitly explain why you win the debate. So language of, and that is why the affirmative wins this issue, that is why the negative cannot win, on that stakeholder is all totally fine and even encouraged. You kind of don't need to have all the, politeness that some insist on in other debate formats where you kind of, it's taboo to say that you won. Replies, you just got to go for it. Also, you should obviously add extra framing and weighting to issues. So what I mean by that is I think it's fine to kind of give new reasons in a reply why an issue already given in the debate is more important than some speakers thought it was earlier. So some people will disagree with that, saying, well, giving new reasons why an issue is important in the debate is just like giving new reasons in a debate. But I kind of think it's fine if it's just specifically in explaining why the debate that's already happened should be adjudicated one way or the other. Although, as I've said, kind of use that with a note of caution and don't go crazy in adding lots and lots of new framing and lots of new weighting. And obviously you should then address what the core questions of the debate are. In terms of the don'ts, do not add new arguments or new examples or new rebuttal. It's kind of very hard to get away with it. It's very obvious when a team suddenly has a new response to an argument at negative reply, and kind of all the strategies to hide it are never actually that effective. And that's, I think, especially true for new examples. So kind of new language to describe arguments, or new arguments altogether, can't be credited in a reply, in much the same way that if an adjudicator came out and just gave a brand new reason why the negative team won that the negative team never said, you would obviously think that's a pretty bad adjudication. Similarly, don't unfairly represent material just because it's kind of easier to. So often in replies, you kind of get too into the swing of building up a narrative of your team winning, and you get kind of very into the flow of it, and you might disregard arguments to get in the way of that narrative, or you might present material in a way that is not so representative of what the other team actually meant. And that's particularly unstrategic at negative reply, because obviously the affirmative reply comes right after you and says, no, we were not saying that, we were actually saying this much more reasonable and sensible argument. Thirdly, don't spend too much time re-explaining arguments. So what I mean by that is often teams, when they get to a reply, spend time as if they were then the first speaker again, saying, we gave you 3 reasons why this outcome would happen. First reason, and then kind of fully explains it as if it's the first time it's being explained in the debate. You don't really have any need to do that because the adjudicator's already heard all of those arguments. So it's fine to just say, we gave you 3 reasons why outcome X would happen. We told you firstly blah, secondly blah, thirdly blah. Kind of just like the headers or the headlines for those arguments instead. I think the only case where it might be necessary to re-explain an argument is where it has been mischaracterized or misunderstood by the other team. Then it's kind of useful to say, what we meant when we said at first affirmative was actually this, kind of to make it much clearer what you're actually saying. But generally, it's much better to just bam, bam, bam through arguments you've made, and where necessary, then re-impact or explain why those arguments are more important in the debate. Similarly, you don't need to feel like you need to address every argument and clash and bit of rebuttal in the debate. You obviously need to be strategic, like at that point, nearly an hour of people speaking has happened, so to compress that all into 4 minutes requires quite a significant degree of, I guess, kind of selectivity, so trying to be clear and brutal on what is actually important to fit into your reply, because if you try and fit too much in, then you lose out on some other parts of the debate because you won't have time. And finally, don't focus on what you said in your speech, which I think also is very obvious when people do it. So, if you just kind of bring out arguments that were in your speech that no one else really engaged with, and kind of just present them as that without giving them any new kind of weighting, or new impacts in the debate to the expense of responses that came out later, or if you only give responses that came in your speech, it's much less persuasive, and it kind of just feels like a repeat of the first negative speech, where obviously it needs to be more of a summary of the debate overall. So make sure that you kind of note multiple people's contributions to the debate, because everyone will have made contributions. Okay, in terms of kind of the writing of a reply, and we'll get into the physical, like when do you do it in a bit, but in terms of what goes in it, it's easy to fall into the habits where you just do kind of the more simple route, so you just say, what came out at first affirmative, how did the team respond it, what was the response to that response, etc., down the bench. But it's much better to instead try and have the most strategic reply possible. And I think the best way to think about that is to identify what the path to victory for both teams is. People also, I guess, call that like the win strategy. It's essentially just, why did the other team win? And you should be kind of able to explain that in a sentence or so to your teammate, or like, imagine if your mum asked you after the debate, like, oh, how did you win, or what did you win on? That's the kind of the sentence you'd be able to say. And that kind of, as a sentence, should be specific. So your path to victory shouldn't be, we rebutted all of their arguments and they didn't rebut ours, or we had lots of benefits and they had not many harms. You kind of should explain it in real words of the debate and kind of what material actually came out. So then also, if you have two paths to victory, well, like, that's great, and that will happen, but that's not either necessary or sufficient. So you can have 4 paths to victory, but if the other team has one really good one and they've done a better job of proving it, they'll win. Like, it's not a numbers game, it's just about kind of content there. So it's about who has kind of done the better job of articulating why the team has won. So I think that then is often a somewhat tricksy concept to try and figure out. Like, what you did to win is often very hard to think about, so we'll try and make that a bit easier to do. So the kind of things to consider are, what arguments are you really sure you've proven? Like, what has been unresponded to, what has come out earlier that you gave a bunch of reasons for and they didn't really respond to them, or you gave some really convincing reasons and they kind of gave some very weak responses. And if that's something that you're pretty sure at the end of the debate you've proven, is there a way that you win off that argument? And if there is, then that is a path to victory. So, if we prove that this will be better for religious minorities, which we have, we will win this debate because that is a really important thing to have proven. Is a pretty clear path to victory. Then there's kind of some sub-questions you should ask. So, like, is there a characterization that you need to have proven for your arguments to be true? So, is there some element of the debate which is, predetermined or a prerequisite to have proven before you prove other parts? And if so, you've got to make sure you've kind of shored that up. Other arguments have gone un or under-responded to. So that's kind of the first thing to look at. Then it's like, what are the most important arguments in the debate? So usually those are the ones where the most time has been spent, but not always, and I would kind of avoid falling into a trap of assuming that those are the most discussed are the most important. But I think it's kind of an indication, although you should think critically, but what has the biggest impact, what affects the most people, what is the most morally important harm? And then you should also think about how different issues might interact with one another. So, is a principal argument that they've given reliant on a practical outcome? Is an argument that they've given reliant on a particular group acting in a certain way, as another issue discusses? Is a micro-level impact reliant on some kind of macro-level change? Those are the kind of things to think about. And again, I'm aware that lots of the things I've just said are, again, a little bit up in the air. So what we're going to do now is kind of go through an actual reply to make it a bit clearer what some of those terms mean. So let's get this to load. Cool, so what we're going to do here is talk through a debate, essentially. And then at the end there's a reply for both teams that we'll talk through. So if we imagine the topic is, we should require all free trade agreements to be passed by national referenda before implementation, we can kind of just summarise this debate as it went. I also only wrote first and second speeches because it's easier, and there's obviously less in these than there would be in a normal speech for simplicity's sake. But let's go through. So essentially, first F says, we need it for democracy, we would love direct democracy, we can't do it always, but this is important. Why is it important? It affects people, they get jobs, they get goods, there's sometimes important legal things in them, and they're kind of similar to other places we use them. This is important because democracy is important. And then we say what would lead to better FTAs, there might be more consultation, and then bad FTAs will just be voted down. So those that don't help people will get rid of, and currently governments kind of sneakily negotiate them with influence from big business or business lobbies, and that's bad, and this stops it. First neg doesn't do a new bottle, again for simplicity's sake. So they essentially say, well, it's not necessary for democracy, you can already influence the outcomes by voting for your candidates or by protesting or campaigning, and we don't really need this extra level for free trade agreements. Then they say, well, it will lead to worse FTAs, so you're less So there's two kind of arguments here. You say you're less able to negotiate for them first up, like states can't be sure that other countries will then hold them when they're reached, because their referenda might be voted down, so it hurts the negotiation process. And that people kind of make bad decisions. They don't really know what they're doing, they don't have the information, they might be hesitant to change, they might be lobbied by certain groups, and maybe referenda don't actually represent the free trade agreement, but might represent broader public debates like what is the relationship between America and China, rather than is this particular free trade agreement good. Then we kind of get into the rebuttal from second. So, is it needed for democracy? They say, the things their influences that say you can do it in other ways aren't good enough. You can't vote based on parties because they might have a different stance on FTAs than you would like, even if you agree with them otherwise. And you can't really influence with protests or campaigns. Then they say, well, even if we can't negotiate, it's not a bad thing if it takes longer to make and form free trade agreements. Then they say, well, people actually will make good decisions, we'll give them information, they can understand if they'll lose a job or not. Cool, second neg, they talk about if it's needed for democracy. They say, well, it's actually less important than getting good free trade agreements. That's what we care about the most. It's not an absolute principle to vote on everything you have. Then they say, well, what impact will it have on free trade agreements? It's hard to consult with everyone. The AF says bad ones will be voted down. They say, but people can't judge it well, so you don't know. And then responding to second AF when they say, well, we'll give people information. Maybe they won't understand it. You can't give objective information here. Then second neg, I guess, as substantive, which is like, the process of them will be bad. It will lead to all this kind of racist, nationalist frames to sell this, which leads to more kind of racism about particular groups. I think the kind of China example is in mind there. Cool. So that's, I guess, a very simplified debate that's happened. If you want to have a look at any of that, you can look at the tiny URL link, and it just links you here, and you can have a read through, because I obviously didn't go through that very slowly. So then we kind of get into what the replies would do based on what debate has happened there. So we go to the negative reply first, because as we said, they go in reverse order. So for the negative reply, the core question is, what is the path to victory for the negative team? Their core path to victory is that this will lead to significantly worse free trade agreements, and that then outweighs all other concerns. So they're essentially saying, we have proven this argument about free trade agreement, and that is the most important argument in the debate. So then we get into the first issue. So here the kind of purple is commentary that I'll make, and the black is actual things that they would say. So I think here we can start out with what effect would this have on FTAs, and here we should lead with this issue first because it's the most important one. It's usually better to lead with the things that you're most ahead on to establish yourself in the debate. Then the first question we kind of ask is, well, are people able to accurately determine their preferences? So asking these kinds of core questions on the debate is useful by identifying what is, I often call, a pivot point of the debate. So the debate kind of turns on whether or not people can accurately determine their preferences, because, if they are, then it will be good at getting better FTAs, and if they can't, it will lead to bad FTAs. So that's kind of a point of characterization that I was talking about before that then affects the rest of them. So what is the characterization of people, and is it one of understanding or one of ignorance? And then we explain, well, the affirmative must prove this claim to get their benefits, because otherwise people won't vote for things that are good for them. So we identify the pivot point, and then we explain what its conclusion is on the debate. So we kind of asked it as a question, and then we start about explaining it. So we've said, no, people are not able to accurately determine their preferences. We give you 5 reasons at first negative, and then we kind of list, and here you would just listen out. You'd say, people don't have the information, they don't have the understanding, they're misled by powerful groups, the FTAs represent broader issues, and people have fundamental biases. Like 5 reasons you wouldn't bother explaining any of those. Then we can point out that the opposition kind of failed to engage with that. So we'd say, we gave you these 5 reasons, their only response came at second affirmative, when they said, well, we would model in giving them information. But that claim is one that we dealt with handily at second negative by pointing out that that information cannot be understood and it cannot be objective for those people, but we also gave you a series of other reasons why they still would not be able to vote effectively. And here it's kind of good to track who says what. So if you notice, we're kind of saying what speakers say. So at first neg, we gave you these reasons. At second after they responded, and at second neg, we dealt with that response. And obviously that gets harder when there's more people in the debate. But for this kind of debate, I think we're dealing with it more simply. So then we finish by concluding the kind of pivot point we start out by identifying. So we say, we've dealt with the actual analysis of the debate, so therefore these referenda will actually subvert people's interests because they cannot accurately determine their preferences and cannot vote in order to pursue those preferences. Then we can ask another kind of sub-question under this issue to kind of even further advance our path to victory. So, even if people are able to vote accurately, will they be voting on better FTAs? So I think it's kind of good to set it up as a series of things that the opposition needs to prove or overcome, or a series of different ways that you can win. So kind of asking the even-ifs of it. So, can people vote accurately? No, they can't. Even if they can, will they be voting on good things? So here you bring out a point that's kind of been unresponded to. So we say, well, countries find it harder to create FTAs. And then you can, so they'll then be harder to create. And then you can comment on what the other team is doing. So I would say, the affirmative team here only mitigates the impact of this argument or denies whether or not its outcome is beneficial, but does not deny the mechanisms that we set up. So at second affirmative, they just say, well, it doesn't actually matter if it takes longer to create these FTAs, if there's uncertainty in the voting process for all the different countries. So then all you need to do is answer whether or not that is actually harmful for them. So we say, but actually, we show you in this argument that if it takes longer, it means less time in the formation, less time of people enjoying the benefits of those FTAs, and that uncertainty is harmful for being able to accurately and bring in every country to that process. So we can do some work here in kind of claiming, an outcome is obvious to fill out the gaps in the argument because we didn't spend much time at first explaining why it would be harmful if they take longer, but here we can kind of do some work to massage or imply why that argument is important, but obviously preferably don't do that, please give reasons your arguments are important in your cases. And then to kind of conclude this issue, we can bring in some second speaker substantives, so we can say, and we also gave you this additional harm of more racism as a result, which could hurt the free trade agreement negotiation process. And then we would do something to conclude the issue, which is, so this will not lead to people voting on effective FTAs, and it will lead to worse FTAs that they are voting on, and that is detrimental for anyone who would benefit from a free trade agreement. Then we kind of bring on to the issue that we're more defensive of. So when you've been defensive on a kind of argument, as I outlined here, you can pursue 3 strategies. You can mitigate its importance, you can minimize the extent to which the other team is winning on it, or you can show it's reliant on an issue we have won. So here then we do all of those 3 strategies. So it would say something like, given that we've shown you this is bad for free trade agreements, the affirmative then tries to win on democracy and democratic outcomes, but firstly, as we told you at first negative, fulfilling democracy is not more important than dollars in pockets that good free trade agreements can bring to people. So this is kind of what I mean by novel commentary a little bit on which issues are more important. So we somewhat say this at first negative, or maybe second negative, I forget. But I think we could then give some more reasons why money is more important than democracy. So then we could say, secondly, we also showed there are some alternatives to fulfilling democracy, so we're minimizing the extent to which they win it, like you can vote on your representative, you can protest or campaign, so even if those are unideal, it's not such a loss on democracy. And then we pursue the final strategy by saying, one, even if then people can't vote accurately, they're actually not fulfilling the democratic preference. So we're showing how an issue that we're losing, democracy, is reliant on an issue we have won, whether or not people are good at voting. So we can kind of bring in this new commentary to say, well, if people can't vote accurately, then they're not fulfilling their democratic preference. So it's a way of using existing arguments to kind of win on their terms, so showing how certain issues impact other issues. So we'd say, so they can't win on democracy unless they also win on showing people can accurately vote. As we've shown you in the earlier issue, they can't. So I think that's kind of what the negative reply strategy would be like in order to win the debate. Cool, so then how would the affirmative go about doing it with the exact same debate that's happened? So the affirmative here has two paths to victory. The first is, well, this is necessary for democracy, and that this will lead to better FTAs. So both of those can separately win the debate for the affirmative, while the negative kind of only had one. But they were obviously doing better on one of those paths than the other, the democracy one, so again, you should start out with the one that you're winning on. So the first thing you should do in this kind of leading out this issue is to comment on what the strategies of the different teams are. Oh, sorry. Whoops. So I would then start out by pointing out where you have multiple paths to victory and kind of where they're on the defensive a little bit more. So I would say, as the affirmative, we argue that this is an absolute requirement for proper democracy. People who are affected by these, we would like to have everyone vote on them. It's analogous to other instances, kind of, again, giving the headlines for the arguments that we've made, and then say, how does the other team try and get around it? The strategy of the negative is to show that, well, perhaps this is unnecessary, or that other options are sufficient. But we absolutely demonstrated there is not sufficient capacity to demonstrate democratic will on free trade agreements. To RAF, when we say that you can't accurately vote for representatives on every issue and campaigns are too weak, and then to kind of comment on the strategy overall. So even then, if there is some ability right now to vote democratically or to democratically influence FTAs, an additional increase in democracy was still a large benefit for the affirmative team, that we were doing a much better job of fulfilling this kind of democracy. Then, what we've got to note here is, as the affirmative, sometimes new strategies will emerge in the reply right before you, as we did in the negative reply just then. So, that's obviously then something you still need to address. So, as we remember, the negative reply said something like, well, democracy, in order to function properly, requires people to accurately determine and accurately vote on their preferences. So then we should point it out. I think we should still point it out that it came out late, but pointing out that an argument came out late in the debate is not a way of addressing the argument. So you'd say, at negative reply, they instead pivot and claim that, well, democracy requires accurate voting, but we fundamentally constructed this argument that it was independent of the nature of the vote, that there was a right to determine policies that affect you and to be included in that process of democracy. So again, that's a way of somewhat reforming an argument that we've made, or reframing it, to get around this new strategy that comes out later. So how then do we conclude this issue? We essentially say, well, this is at least an independent win for the side affirmative. We bring back the stuff about why democracy is really important, like people have rights to it, people, pay their taxes, people follow the laws of the country, they've got to be able to vote on things that affect them. So we fundamentally win. But then you can point out, well, even if we don't win, we at least significantly increase the burden on the other teams. And I guess as a side note here, this is often a useful way to think about principles in general. So if a principle is kind of being violated, then you need a really clear reason to do so. So in order to subvert or undermine democracy here, the negative needs to prove there is a significant and overwhelming benefit for free trade agreements. And then we can do a bit more to how we do with the other strategy. For the negative reply, where we start out with a win, and then show how the other teams tried to overcome it. So you can kind of think about it as like, we've shown this much benefit, how do they go about accruing as much benefit? So we've shown this much benefit for democracy, do they show equal or enough benefit to FTAs to overcome that? So then we ask, will using referenda improve FTAs, or if we want to ask it more strategically, like, why will using referenda improve FTAs, kind of implying the answer to the question that we would like. So essentially, I would start out by asking, how did the negative go about trying to prove a harm to free trade agreements? They highlighted reasons maybe the vote would go poorly, that people, and again here I would give even less time to those reasons unless you were rebutting them individually. So I would just say they gave a large number of reasons at first neg that were essentially people won't understand the intricacies of that free trade agreement. So kind of rebutting them as a group if you don't have individual responses. If you do have individual responses, I would separate them out a little bit more, but again, that's the timing thing. So, and then you can rebut them as a group. So we say, but to affirmative, we can inform them, and people can understand the things that are most important, or most impactful to them, like will they lose their job. And then you can also comment on the extent to which a team needs to prove an argument or what the burden of it is. So the negative team needs to prove that people are so bad at voting as to accurately and often vote against their own interests. So all we're proving is that people are good enough at voting to give it a better job, or to give a good job at it, so they have a reasonable ability to understand and a reasonable ability to vote, rather than, even if that is not perfect, it will improve FTAs. And then we can pivot to highlighting the kind of comparative to overcome an argument that we're a little bit behind on. So we haven't done a very good job of proving that people are kind of perfect voters, but we can bring back material from First Affirmative that says, well, even if these votes are imperfect, they're still preferable to the current ways in which free trade agreements are determined, which I think we kind of say is a bit of a throw line, which is like, it's in government backrooms driven by private corporations, which means those are really, really bad ways of determining free trade agreements, and this at least gives some kind of counterweight to it, even if people are uninformed, or not perfectly informed. So I think that's kind of how the affirmative would go about it, and then you give some lines summarising what you'd say. So we have argued that free trade agreements will improve, because people are better at voting. Even if they don't improve perfectly, they're better than the status quo, and even if they don't improve at all, the negative did not prove as sufficient harm to free trade agreements to overcome our large benefit of democracy. So I think that's essentially how the two replies would go for that example, and let's go back to the presentation. Cool. Into the physical writing of a reply, I guess I have a couple of pointers. So I would say don't start too early, because if you start, if you're first AF and you start writing your reply as soon as you sit down, you're more likely to end up talking more about things you said and tracking the debate as existed early rather than later on. I would kind of suggest that it takes maybe 2 speeches to write a reply. So if you're the negative reply, I would start writing at the start of nerd affirmative, like physically writing. And if I'm the affirmative reply, I would start writing maybe halfway through nerd affirmative. But even when you're not writing your actual reply, you should be writing some things about the debate. So you should be writing what everyone's saying and tracking potential observations about it. So normally what I do is I write down what everyone says in black, and then in blue I write down little observations about why an argument might be reliant on another argument, or what's been unresponded to, or what's been a really good argument from us. Yeah, so I think kind of colours works, but it's kind of do whatever you want, kind of you'll figure it out. It can be a bit different to writing a normal speech, but it's not super different. Similarly, as I said before, don't try and cram in too much, be very selective in what you include, and really importantly, talk to your teammates as you go, so you won't always hear everything that they say, because you might be writing a reply, so ask them questions after they sit down, like, or while on the bench, like, what did we say to this response from the other team? What was our best argument? Did you have anything in your speech? Did you have anything in your speech you didn't get to in time? Did you have anything they still haven't responded to? So the reply shouldn't be a representation of what you think your team did to win the debate. It should be a representation of how your team as a whole won the debate, and you're just like the person delivering it. Cool. I'll kind of finish off with a couple of extra things that I found useful to get around some reply things. So these are a little bit beyond the kind of introductory writing of replies, but I think they'll be useful in the future, or for people who've done some replies before. So the first thing I would say is that you can replace a need for rebuttal by flipping the onus onto the opposition. So what I mean by that is, rather than rebutting an argument that you think has been a little bit underdeveloped by the opposition, or that you haven't really responded to, you can then point it out or pretend that it's a failure of them to explain it properly. So if we think about the argument in the debate earlier, when second negative says something about, these referenda will lead to lots of racist nationalist discourse, would the affirmative never responded to it, rather than making up a response in my affirmative reply, I would just say, they gave you this argument second negative, but they never proved either that the discourse around this would actually be racist, or that work was not sufficiently given in the argument to explain why it would take a racist rather than an economic form of argument, or secondly, they never proved that racism would be in addition to existing racism, rather than just giving a different avenue for current racists to express their beliefs. So they never proved this would increase the amount of total racist discourse, as a way of kind of having some rebuttal, but framing it as a failure of them to explain their argument properly. Secondly, I think it can be really useful to comment on how persuasive different arguments are. By that I don't mean just say all of yours are great and all of theirs are bad. So some people often give replies by kind of predicating all of their responses by like, our phenomenal response at first to F. Our second crushing argument was this. Our final brilliant point was blah. Instead, you should kind of have levels to what you think is good and kind of be fair in when an argument is good and kind of, I guess, be a bit willing to point out when some arguments are worse. So sentences like, the opposition began by claiming blah, but we told you this, obviously. However, their better claim was then to explain this. Or, we first told you why, which the opposition did address, but they neglected what was our far more persuasive claim, this other claim. Or, and finally, the truly crushing blow for this negative team came when we argued and then put in your best argument. So kind of recognizing when certain arguments are better than others, or when certain points of yours are better than other points, kind of brings the adjudicator on side of you and lets them focus on what is more important. So you say, our most important claim was blah, puts an emphasis onto that claim then. Cool, a couple of extra things. I would watch out for when an argument goes unresponded to, because you can really do a lot with it in your reply, so it gives you an extra time when they can't really respond to it to spend some time saying, and this was really, really crucial to the debate. Similarly, the inverse of that advice is then got to make sure the other team doesn't have arguments or things that are left in the debate that they could pretend that they won the debate on. So that's not to say you need to respond to, like, every sub-level or every sub-reason in a debate, but you do need to make sure that anything they could bring out in reply as a way of suggesting they won has been at least somewhat dealt with in the debate. Finally, I would suggest that replies themselves can also alter the strategy of other speakers, so because under negative you're about to have kind of a summary of the debate coming out, nerd negative needs to do less summary or less meta-commentary than other speakers, but nerd affirmative, because you're about to go into the negative block, needs to do a bit more to kind of establish the affirmative in the debate. Finally, I would say that you should not be mean. It's kind of a bit easier in replies, or a bit harder rather, to control some impulses like, making fun of arguments, or making it really clear that you think your team has won or the other team hasn't been very good. That's just like very bad debating, and in a reply it's also not very persuasive. You should deal with all of the best stuff that they brought out, and kind of explain as objectively as possible why you think your team has won. Cool, so I think this was meant to be a live presentation when I would have taken some questions, but that won't be possible. I think it might be best to leave some comments wherever this will be posted, and if you have questions, I'll check back in a couple of days, and I'll just kind of write out a response for any of those. Alright, I hope this has worked.